The spotlights carved through the cigarette smoke like searchlights, hunting for truth in a room built on beautiful lies. Another awards ceremony. Another temple of golden statues and borrowed dignity, where the music industry gathered to worship at the altar of its own importance. The producers had been crystal clear about the dress code. Black tie. Full formal attire. This was not a request. It was a commandment handed down from the corporate gods who believed they owned every note, every voice, every soul that dared to make music for a living. Dean Martin was supposed to present an award that night, and everyone expected the uniform, the crisp lines of a tailored tuxedo, the bow tie that strangled just enough to remind you who was in charge, the polished shoes that clicked against marble floors like the ticking of a very expensive clock, counting down the minutes until your contract expired and they found someone younger, hungrier, more willing to smile on command. But Dean had been smiling on command for 30 years, and something inside him had finally grown tired of the performance. He walked into that ballroom wearing a cardigan sweater, not even an expensive one, the kind your neighbor might throw on to water his lawn on a Sunday morning. Soft, comfortable, utterly indifferent to the weight of expectation that hung in the air like expensive perfume. Every other man in that room was dressed for battle, armor plated in silk and satin, ready to wage war for relevance. Dean looked like he'd wandered in from a different decade, a different world, a place where music mattered more than the machinery that packaged it. The producers panicked in the wings. Security didn't know whether to escort him out or ask for his autograph. But Dean was already moving through the crowd with that loose, easy grace that made everything look effortless, even rebellion, especially rebellion. The cameras found him, and the audience held its collective breath, waiting to see if the king of cool would acknowledge the elephant in the room or simply pretend that cardigans had always been formal wear. What they couldn't see, what the lights and the laughter couldn't touch, was the quiet storm behind his eyes. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't Dean being Dean, the lovable drunk who showed up late and charmed his way out of trouble. This was a line in the sand, drawn by a man who had spent decades letting everyone else feel comfortable while he quietly disappeared behind the character they'd built around him. He'd been their dancing bear for so long that they'd forgotten he was still a man underneath the costume, still someone with opinions, with boundaries, with a breaking point that looked deceptively like a smile. The cardigan wasn't a punchline. It was a prayer, a quiet plea for the right to be human in a room full of people who had forgotten what that meant. He walked onto that stage, and the applause came like it always did, but this time it felt different, uncertain. The audience was clapping for the Dean they expected, but the man standing before them was someone else entirely. Someone who had finally decided that looking cool meant nothing if you weren't willing to stand for something when it counted. Years later, a stagehand would find that cardigan in a dressing room trash can and rescue it, understanding somehow that some moments matter more than the people who create them. He'd frame it, hang it in his garage next to a faded photo of Dean on stage, collar open, eyes clear, finally free from the weight of everyone else's expectations. Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy, but stories like this reveal the heavy cost of that. Cool. If you want to keep the memory of the true Rat Pack alive, consider supporting the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support helps us uncover these lost legends. Now, let's go back to the moment when a simple sweater became a symbol of something much larger. The tuxedos hung in his closet like a row of beautiful executioners, each one pressed and patient, waiting to perform their familiar ritual of erasure. Dean Martin stood barefoot on the carpet, one hand resting against the doorframe as if the wood itself were the only thing keeping him tethered to something real. For 30 years, this had been the uniform of his success, the armor that transformed a man into a brand, a human being into a product that could be packaged, shipped, and sold to the highest bidder. The entertainment industry had a peculiar way of loving you to death. They built you up brick by brick until you forgot what solid earth felt like. then handed you a script for how to breathe in public and called it protection. The letter had arrived that Tuesday, delivered by messenger, because everything that pretends to be important in Hollywood gets delivered by messenger. Standard correspondence, professional, polite, absolutely non-negotiable. The Grammy Awards would be honored to have Mr. Martin present. Formal attire required, black tie, no exceptions. But Dean understood what those words really meant. The dress codes weren't suggestions for fashion, they were assertions of ownership. When they told you how to look, they believed they could control who you were. The memo didn't just dictate fabric and cut. It was a reminder that to the industry, he wasn't a man with a heart and history. He was a tuxedo with a voice attached, a prop to be positioned for maximum ratings. He'd been living in a beautiful cage, certainly, gilded with gold records and velvet ropes and the adoration of millions, but a cage nonetheless. The world had convinced itself that Dean was the one man who didn't care, buying the act completely, the slouch, the slurred speech, the tumbler that was usually apple juice. They believed he was sleepwalking through stardom, a lucky drunk who stumbled into greatness. The truth was far more exhausting. Dean Martin was a craftsman of the highest order, a man of immense discipline, who worked tirelessly to make sure nobody ever saw him sweat. Behind closed doors, away from the lights and laughter, he was everything the business didn't particularly value. Sober more often than anyone understood, early to call times, lines memorized, arrangements rehearsed, a human being hiding inside a cartoon. The public saw effortless cool. The studios saw guaranteed ratings. Nobody saw the man who had to carry that image like a burden strapped to his back, who watched scared kids with big voices shake in the wings because they were terrified of getting one note wrong in front of people who held their futures in manicured hands. He reached out and touched one of the jackets, the fabric cool and smooth under his fingers. How many nights had he worn this same shell while pieces of himself quietly fell away underneath? The older he got, the clearer the injustice became. Somewhere along the line, the music had stopped being the important part. The ceremony cared more about the bow tie than the broken soul wearing it. Then his eyes drifted to the chair beside his bed, where a simple cardigan sweater lay folded, soft, unpretentious, deeply, authentically human. The kind of thing a man wore when he was done performing, when he was safe at home, when he didn't have to lie to anyone about who he was. The air grew heavy with the electricity of a decision being made. He wasn't just choosing clothes. He was preparing to walk into the center of the empire and tell them, without saying a word, that the king of cool was done taking orders. The Grammy people wanted their perfect picture, their obedient star in regulation formal wear. Dean Martin was about to decide whose frame he lived in. The cardigan felt like an act of defiance the moment he pulled it over his shoulders, the soft wool settling against his skin with the quiet authority of a decision that couldn't be undone. Not expensive cashmere or designer fabric, just ordinary knit that had been washed enough times to forget it was supposed to impress anyone. Dean caught his reflection in the bedroom mirror and saw something he hadn't seen in years. A man who looked like he might actually live in his own skin. The morning had begun in that peculiar silence that seems to listen back. No clinking glasses or band rehearsing, just the faint hum of routine and the weight of what was coming. He moved through his preparations with deliberate calm, each small ritual grounding him in something real. The rasp of the razor against his cheek, the soft tap of aftershave on the sink, the gentle brush through his hair. These were the sounds that reminded him there was still a person underneath all the noise, still someone who shaved and dressed and made coffee like any other man preparing for work. But this wasn't any other morning, and the cardigan hanging on the chair wasn't any other choice. He slipped it on, feeling the buttons click through their holes with quiet finality, each one a small lock turning. The drive to the venue stretched out like the last mile before a battle. His driver kept glancing in the rearview mirror, trying to find a diplomatic way to ask if perhaps Mr. Martin had forgotten something, maybe left the tuxedo hanging by accident. But Dean's silence answered every unasked question. Outside, Los Angeles hummed with its usual electric desperation, engines growling at red lights, distant sirens rising and falling like unresolved chords. Inside the car, it was almost completely quiet, just the low swish of windshield wipers and the soft squeak of leather as he shifted, watching the city lights blur past like a kaleidoscope of neon and ambition. When the car pulled up to the red carpet, the air itself seemed to shift. The valet's face told the whole story. That flicker of recognition followed immediately by confusion, mental math trying to reconcile Dean Martin with a man dressed for a Sunday afternoon rather than a nationally televised ceremony. The kid took the keys with trembling hands, probably wondering if this was some elaborate joke he wasn't sophisticated enough to understand. Dean handed him a folded 20 and that sleepy half-smile, walking past the screaming press line without stopping for a single interview. Backstage felt like a courtroom where he was both defendant and judge. The atmosphere was thick enough to choke on, a high-anxiety holding pen where the most famous people on earth paced like nervous thoroughbreds. When Dean entered, conversations didn't just stop, they evaporated. Producers materialized with headsets and clipboards, their faces draining of color as they whispered frantically into walkie-talkies. A woman in sequins actually gasped, her hand flying to her throat as if she'd witnessed something obscene. In a way, she had. This was Hollywood, where authenticity was the only taboo that still had power. They approached with spare tuxedos like peace offerings, voices tight with panic, asking if perhaps he'd be more comfortable in something more appropriate. The word comfortable landed between them like a grenade. Dean just waved them off, poured himself a drink, and stood watching while around him the machinery of Hollywood threatened to overheat. He caught his reflection in a dressing room mirror moments before his cue, looking into his own eyes to verify that the man staring back was still there, still whole, still Dean. The stage manager's voice cracked over the intercom. Heavy velvet curtains were the only thing separating myth from man. He walked toward the light, reached for the microphone, and in that suspended second before his fingers touched the cold metal, the entire entertainment industry held its breath. The applause hit him like a tidal wave of sound, reflexive and automatic, the kind of conditioned response reserved for royalty and living legends. But as Dean Martin stepped fully into the blinding white spotlight, the wave stuttered. A collective hesitation rippled through the auditorium as thousands of brains simultaneously tried to process what they were seeing. Where was the tuxedo? Where was the armor? The king of cool stood before them in a simple cardigan, looking like he just finished reading the Sunday paper in his living room. Dean didn't flinch at their confusion. He leaned into the microphone stand with that familiar, languid grace, but this time it wasn't performance. It was the posture of a man who no longer needed to prove he belonged anywhere. He looked out at the sea of black ties and desperate perfection, at an industry terrified of a single loose thread, and smiled. Not the polished grin for cameras, but something real, something that reached his eyes and said he was finally home in his own skin. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of the practiced slur, clear and measured and utterly present. He talked to them like they were sitting in his living room, discussing music as if it actually mattered more than the machinery that packaged it. He didn't mention the sweater. He didn't acknowledge the breach of protocol. By refusing to explain himself, he forced everyone else to confront their own expectations. In the control booth, producers were undoubtedly screaming into headsets, but the camera operators stayed locked on him. They knew television gold when they saw it. The audience reaction was fascinating to watch unfold. In the front rows, initial shock melted into something more complicated. You could see it especially on the faces of younger artists, a sudden, dawning recognition. They watched him standing there in knit wool, utterly unbothered by the judgment of the most powerful people in music. And they saw what freedom looked like. An older actress in the third row had tears streaming down her cheeks, though she probably couldn't have explained why. Sometimes witnessing courage is enough to crack open whatever we've been holding closed inside ourselves. But the moment he walked off stage, the temperature dropped 40 degrees. The wings were crowded with executives whose faces had turned to masks of fury and fear. The silence backstage was suffocating, heavy with the weight of a power structure that had just been quietly challenged. People who normally would have rushed to congratulate him now busied themselves with clipboards or stared intently at the floor. Power never forgives easily, and Dean had just demonstrated that their authority was optional. A young stagehand, barely 20 and dreaming of his own music career, caught Dean in the hallway. No words, just handed him a cup of coffee and a look that said everything about solidarity and understanding. Dean took the coffee, took the moment, and for the first time that night, his shoulders dropped an inch. Not defeat, relief. He walked straight out the back door without stopping for after-parties or press clamoring for quotes about his fashion statement. The heavy steel door clanged shut behind him with the finality of a choice that couldn't be undone. As he drove through the quiet streets toward home, the city lights looked softer somehow, less demanding. He knew the phone calls would stop, the invitations would dry up, the machine would punish him for showing its gears. But Dean Martin felt lighter than he had in 20 years. He had traded their approval for his own, and the bargain felt more than fair. The punishment came like winter, quiet and complete. Dean's phone sat on the mahogany table like a sullen teenager, refusing to ring with the usual parade of offers and invitations. The industry had spoken in the only language it truly understood: silence. Calls that had been coming for decades simply stopped. Meetings evaporated. Scripts found their way to other actors. In a business built on noise and spectacle, the cruelest weapon was the sound of nothing at all. But silence, Dean would learn, has a way of amplifying what truly matters, and sometimes the quietest rebellions travel the furthest. While executives were busy closing ranks, something entirely different was happening in the shadows where real music lived. Letters began arriving at Dean's house, not through official channels or publicity firms, but handwritten on cheap stationery, some coffee-stained, others written in the shaky hand of the elderly or the furious scrawl of the young. A jazz pianist from Chicago wrote that he'd stopped wearing the uncomfortable suits his manager demanded, taping a grainy newspaper photo of Dean in that cardigan to his bathroom mirror as a daily reminder that comfort wasn't disrespectful, it was honest. A session guitarist carried a yellowed clipping in his wallet for 30 years, pulling it out whenever the pressure to sell out became unbearable. Proof that you could be the coolest man in the room without playing by their rules. The story spread through the underground veins of the music world like contraband wisdom, whispered in dive bars and dressing rooms, passed between musicians who understood that this wasn't about fashion, it was about permission. Young artists facing the crushing machinery of image consultants and branding experts began talking about pulling a Martin, the radical idea that you could simply opt out of the costume while still playing the music. It became a secret history of rebellion that belonged to the artists, not the studios. What made the moment legendary wasn't Dean's promotion of it. He never mentioned the cardigan in interviews, never capitalized on the controversy, never turned his defiance into a marketing strategy. That silence was perhaps the most powerful part of the legacy. By refusing to transform his authenticity into a brand, he kept it pure, dangerous, untouchable. The entertainment industry tried to bury the story, to frame it as an embarrassing lapse by an aging star, but their dismissal only made it matter more to the people who needed it most. The ripple became generational. A drummer who'd watched the broadcast went home and told his teenage daughter, "You should have seen him. He walked out there like he was already free." She carried that sentence for 50 years, eventually sharing it with her own grandson when he became a musician, facing pressure to remake his entire image for a record label. On the night they demanded he change everything about himself, he thought of the man in the cardigan who didn't ask permission to be human. Decades later, a modern pop star would keep a framed photo in her home studio, Dean mid-sentence, looking more like a philosophy professor than a celebrity. When young artists visited and asked about it, she'd tell them the story, then add her own truth. "That sweater saved my life," she'd say, and mean it, because sometimes all we need is one person to go first, to show us that authenticity has a frequency all its own, and it travels farther than any manufactured hit ever could. Years after that night, when someone finally asked Dean about the sweater incident in a quiet, off-camera moment, he just chuckled and said, "I wore what felt right. Isn't that what music's supposed to be about?" He never knew that simple sentence would become a compass for people who'd never hear it from his own lips, passed forward like a secret map out of a gilded prison, one quiet act of courage at a time. The years that followed softened around Dean like old leather, comfortable and worn in all the right places. Time has a peculiar way of stripping the noise away and leaving only the outline of who you really were, and for Dean, that outline looked remarkably like the man who had walked onto that stage in a simple cardigan. The frantic energy that had defined decades of performance gave way to something far more valuable, the luxury of existing without explanation. He moved through his days with the easy grace of someone who had already looked the entertainment industry in the eye and discovered it was just another room full of people trying too hard to impress each other. At home, the world narrowed to things that had always mattered, but had so often been postponed by the demands of being Dean Martin. Family dinners stretched longer, filled with genuine laughter that didn't need microphones or audiences to validate its worth. His daughter would later say those final years felt like meeting her father for the first time, the real man who had been hiding underneath the myth of effortless cool. He'd show up in comfortable clothes and stay for hours, no longer checking his watch against some imaginary schedule dictated by image consultants and publicity machines. The cardigan, or ones like it, became a kind of uniform of peace, draped over kitchen chairs and forgotten on piano benches after evenings of half-finished melodies sung just because the silence felt too heavy without music. The entertainment industry eventually came crawling back, as it always does when talent proves undeniable, but the dynamic had shifted permanently. Dean returned on his own terms, carrying himself with the quiet authority of a man who no longer needed their approval to sleep well at night. The invitations that mattered now came from different places, smaller venues where the music outweighed the spectacle, jazz clubs that smelled like honest sweat and real emotion. One evening, years later, he sat watching a modern awards ceremony on muted television, observing young stars parade in costumes that cost more than most people earned in a decade. Their smiles were bright and brittle, their eyes searching cameras for validation he no longer needed. He reached back and touched the sleeve of a cardigan hanging on his chair, a small, private gesture of gratitude for the night that bought his life back. What Dean couldn't have known was how far his quiet rebellion would travel beyond the boundaries of Hollywood. The story became a philosophical inheritance passed down through generations of artists who felt crushed by the machinery of fame. Songwriters facing pressure to compromise their lyrics, actors told to reshape their bodies and souls, musicians demanded to smile through exploitation. They all carried some version of Dean's cardigan in their hearts. It became shorthand for a particular kind of bravery, the willingness to choose yourself, even when the cost is everything you've built. Eventually, that cardigan found its way into a small music museum, displayed behind glass not as a piece of fashion history, but as an artifact of courage. The modest placard simply read his name and one line, worn against strict dress code. Visitors would pause longer there than at the gold records and platinum albums, some pressing hands to glass, others just staring as if trying to decode what made that piece of fabric feel heavier than metal. Parents brought children to see it, using the story to teach lessons about integrity that no textbook could capture. Because Dean Martin's final gift to the world wasn't just the songs or the perfectly timed punchlines. It was the reminder that the most revolutionary act a human being can commit is simply, quietly, courageously refusing to pretend to be someone they're not. And sometimes, freedom looks exactly like a comfortable sweater on any given day when you decide you've had enough of other people's costumes. The museum lights dim as evening settles over the city, leaving the exhibits bathed in soft amber shadows that make everything feel like a memory waiting to be discovered. But there's something different about the display case in the corner, something that draws visitors away from the glittering gowns and platinum records toward a simple piece of knitwear folded behind glass. They lean in close, breath fogging the surface, trying to understand how something so ordinary could carry the weight of a revolution. The cardigan sits there like a patient teacher, holding lessons about courage that most people spend their whole lives trying to learn. It was a photograph that almost didn't survive, curled at the edges and faded to the color of old tea, buried in a shoebox beneath ticket stubs and forgotten lanyards. A grandson cleaning out his late grandfather's garage found it there, a black and white snapshot of a young stagehand standing beside Dean Martin in a narrow hallway. Dean wore the cardigan, not as costume or publicity stunt, but caught in a moment of genuine laughter with someone the cameras never bothered to notice. On the back, in shaky ink, his grandfather had written 3 words and a date: the night he stood. No explanation, no story, just that simple declaration that somehow contained everything. The grandson went looking for the story the way people search for lost relatives, piecing together fragments from fading interviews and half-remembered conversations. What he discovered wasn't just celebrity gossip, but something that had traveled through generations of invisible people, the ones who set the lights and poured the drinks and pressed the clothes for men who seemed larger than life. For them, watching a legend choose comfort over compliance wasn't entertainment, it was liberation. It suggested that they too were allowed to want their own lives back, that dignity wasn't reserved for the famous. Years later, that same photograph would guide another young woman sitting in a record label office, being told exactly who she needed to become. Thinner, younger, more manufactured than real. They showed her charts and focus groups proving that authenticity didn't sell as well as carefully crafted relatability. She listened to their presentation about her own erasure, nodded politely, and went home to stare at an image she'd printed from the internet. Dean Martin in a cardigan, looking more powerful in wool and defiance than any king in a crown. She quit the label the next morning, started releasing music on her own terms, and built a career that mattered because it belonged to her. When interviewers asked about her independence, she always mentioned the sweater, keeping the story alive for another generation that needed permission to be real. The legend outlived the man, as legends often do, but this one carried different weight than most Hollywood myths. Where other stories grew more spectacular and less true with each retelling, the cardigan incident remained stubbornly simple. A man wore what he wanted. A system tried to punish him. He survived anyway. The power wasn't in the drama, but in the quietness of it. The way Dean had made rebellion look like a shrug while carrying its full cost. That particular alchemy became the template for every artist who came after and decided their soul was worth more than their next contract. What made Dean's choice endure wasn't just the act itself, but what it revealed about the nature of cool. For years, the world had bought the performance, believing that not caring was the source of his magnetism. But the cardigan exposed a deeper truth. Dean Martin was cool because he cared enormously about the right things. He cared about music more than image, about humanity more than celebrity, about being whole more than being worshipped. The real rebellion wasn't wearing casual clothes to a formal event. It was choosing to live as a complete human being in an industry that preferred beautiful fragments it could rearrange at will. The museum curator often found people weeping in front of the display, though they couldn't always articulate why. Perhaps because that simple sweater represented every time they'd bent themselves into shapes that didn't fit. Every smile they'd forced for bosses who didn't deserve it. Every piece of themselves they'd traded for acceptance that never quite arrived. The cardigan was proof that someone had said no and lived to tell about it, that the machine's power was real, but not absolute, that dignity was still an option, even when it came with a price. In the end, Dean Martin didn't just leave behind a catalog of songs or a collection of perfectly timed punchlines. He left something far more valuable: permission to be human. The feeling that it's okay to be flawed, to be tired, to be real. He gave us that permission without ever saying a word about it, simply by walking onto a stage in clothes that made him feel like himself and inviting the rest of us to do the same. We live in a world louder than ever, more demanding of our image, more obsessed with the performance of our lives rather than the living of them. In this noise, Dean's silence remains deafening, his choice standing as a lighthouse for anyone navigating the stormy seas of expectation. The cardigan sits in its case, unassuming and folded, but it carries the echo of that night like a tuning fork struck once and still vibrating. It reminds us that the hardest thing, standing up for yourself when everyone wants you to sit down, is possible. That comfort can be courage. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can say to a system built on your compliance is nothing at all. Just show up as yourself and let the world adjust to your presence instead of the other way around. Dean Martin taught us that being cool wasn't about what you wore or how you walked or whether you could make every joke land perfectly. Being cool was having the strength to be warm, human, flawed, and utterly, defiantly yourself, even when it cost you everything the world said you were supposed to want. He kept what was truly his, and because of him, maybe we can keep ours too.